All right, so we are recording. So for those of you that maybe are joining the call just now, my name is Tara Ade. I'm the Director of Prevention and Education here at Safe Haven, and I definitely see some familiar faces, and as I was watching the registration come in, definitely some familiar emails, but I just want to say welcome, and thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about this topic. I know that it can be a really stressful time, and so I appreciate you giving of your time to help better support those in the community and ultimately support Safe Haven and our mission as well. I added my contact information up here, and so you all are welcome to reach out to me after this conversation if you have additional questions, or if it just is a safer space for you to send those via email. I totally understand that, and I want to make myself available for that. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but Safe Haven is still fully operational. And so though most of us may be working remotely, we have some measures in place that if reaching me by phone is the most practical way for you, we can definitely arrange to have that happen as well through some call transferring and things like that. I also have some other my coworkers on the call. I see Jared and Maddie, Holly, and Katie. They all work at Safe Haven in a couple different capacities, both on the fundraising side and direct service, and then folks from my team that also help do a lot of the prevention work that we're doing in the community. And so they may also chime in to help facilitate this conversation as well. One thing I want to pause for really quickly is that these conversations can be really tough. And I think one of the things that we've really started to recognize in the last few weeks is that while domestic violence is something that has always been hard to address and to talk about, I think that a global health pandemic can often compound some of those stressors. And as all of you are probably working really hard to support those in your communities, just recognizing that that's really tough work. And it can be extremely taxing. Really trying to normalize some of that as well. And so if during our conversation today or even post our conversation, things come up for you as a result of these conversations, just really encouraging you to take the time and space to care for yourself as well. And also reminding you that Safe Haven is a resource, not just for folks that are immediately in crisis. We also often walk alongside people that are supporting others. We also often are supporting folks that have experienced domestic violence in their past, and for whatever reason, it comes back up for them. And so really encouraging you to reach out as you feel comfortable if that's something that you need. The other thing that I want to really kind of talk about to frame our conversation, and I like to do this in a lot of my different trainings, is really encouraging us to practice vulnerability today. It's really a unique experience where we get so many different faith traditions and backgrounds in one space. And there's so much potential for us to learn and grow from one another. And so the expectation is not that we are going to have all of the answers today or going to fix all of our worldly problems, but I am really energized and excited by the idea that we can lean on one another to learn new and innovative ways to work through this. As you all have seen, things are ever changing, sometimes by the minute and by the hour. And so just really encouraging you to maybe stretch yourself a little bit if you're able to, and contribute in ways that can help us collectively grow as a community. All right, so to kind of get us warmed up and check in with all of you, I have a little prompt to get us started. So in the chat box, which hopefully you all have discovered that by now, I want you to do a few things. I want you to give us your name. Maybe if you feel comfortable, tell us what faith community you are representing today. And if you're not, that's okay too. And then two options. One thing you hope to learn today, or one challenge you've encountered while providing support to a victim or survivor of domestic violence, either pre-pandemic or especially if you've encountered some challenges in our current time. So I'll go ahead and give us about a minute or two to do that. All right, so we've got a lot of stuff coming in today. One of the things that I'm seeing is how to learn how to better come alongside women who are not physically being abused, but are not safe in their homes. I think that's a really valid concern. It looks like Anne is asking about what services are currently available. A lot of questions around like what resources are available. A challenge that one person is facing is helping someone support a family member who is experiencing verbal abuse, who doesn't see the need to deal with it. And we'll talk a lot about just how we support victims and survivors in all different stages of their healing, because not every person that's experiencing violence, as you've noted, Mara, may be ready or willing to seek those supports. And so what do we do in situations like that? Some more information too, challenges about how being isolated or stuck at home can create more challenges, vulnerabilities. So we'll definitely get to some of that stuff as well. So I'll let you all continue doing that as I continue on with our training. So I wanted to take a moment and just talk a little bit about Safe Haven Services, because I recognize that we definitely have some new faces on this call. I also want to recognize that a lot has changed with Safe Haven in the last year or so. And so if you haven't had a touch point with us in the last year and a half, some things may look a little different than they did 2 years ago. And so one of the biggest changes that we've had here at Safe Haven is we are now under one facility. So about 2 years ago, we had some land donated to Safe Haven over by, is everybody familiar with where Pietro's is on 28th Street? Yeah, I see lots of heads shaking. So our new building is located at the corner of Saginaw and Birchcrest. And so we had land donated there, and in March of 2018, we broke ground and moved into our new facility at the end of 2018. So at the end of 2018. So we're just past a year in our new facility. The biggest thing is that we're all under one roof. And so our shelter, our direct services, support groups, everybody is all housed under that one building. And we obviously are not a confidential location anymore. And oftentimes I get questions around, well, how do you provide safety to somebody if folks know where your shelter is? And what we've really found through our research is that we're able to create more safety by building something from the ground up and building those safety mechanisms within the building. Another thing that we have learned from doing this work is that when the community has visibility around something like a shelter, there tends to be more accountability to keep that space safe. And so, as we'll talk about as we continue our conversations, abusers really flourish in environments where their abuse goes unchecked, where they don't have a lot of accountability over their actions. And so if an abuser were to come to Safe Haven space, they really risk being held accountable for their actions, or individuals learning that they are abusive. And so being a public location inherently actually deters some of that behavior. But if it did ever rise to that, we have a number of safety measures put in place as well. So up on the slide here, you'll see some of the services that we offer. We are a 24/7, 365 agency. I used to always joke that, we're open on Christmas, we're open on all holidays, And now I can also insert, we are also open during a health pandemic. And so it has been a lot of ups and downs for us just navigating this new normalcy, which I'm sure is very familiar to all of you as well. But one of the things that we have really held strongly to is that we are absolutely an essential service in this community. And as folks shelter in place as a way of keeping themselves safe, that does not always translate to it being a safer situation for those experiencing violence. And so our services are just as, if not more important than they ever have been. And so this hotline that I'm showing you, as I kind of talked about earlier, is available to anyone, anytime. Let's say, for example, that you are supporting somebody in your congregation and you're not quite sure what to do. You get stuck. You can always reach out to us and we can help brainstorm and provide some feedback and suggestions without you even having to disclose your name or that victim survivor's name, if it's important for you to maintain that confidentiality. Our emergency safe shelter is still up and running as well. One of the new changes in our new facility is increased capacity around sheltering survivors. So we have 14 rooms and 56 beds at our facility. And another thing that I want to emphasize here too is that we serve all survivors. And so it is not just a shelter available to women and children. We know that domestic violence reaches all different communities, not just women. And so making note of that as you all work with folks in your respective lives. We normally offer case management and support group, obviously in person at Safe Haven and in the community. However, we've had to move a lot of those services virtual, but we're still trying our best to offer those. And in fact, this week, I believe, we launched our first virtual support group. Actually, we'd had a Spanish-speaking support group going for a few weeks, but this week was our first time launching an English support group. And so more so than ever, we're finding that creating those spaces are really important for people during a time of isolation. And so I'll come back to that in a moment. So just, what's changed since entering into this stay-at-home order? Not much in the sense of like the types of services that we offer. It just looks a little different how we're going about offering those. And so one thing that we're seeing is a lot of folks reaching out to us virtually instead of just showing up at our office. And so I would say, I don't know, Holly, if you would add anything different to some changes you've seen and how folks are engaging our services.
Yeah, I think we definitely have seen, just echo that. Definitely seeing individuals who are more likely to reach out through email, going to our website. We have an email option to connect with staff. Through our social media, we're getting an increase in engagement. So sometimes just those are easier and safer ways to connect with their advocates and to get support. So certainly have seen an increase in those modalities being used.
Good. Perfect. The other thing, if you aren't familiar, in addition to our hotline, Safe Haven also monitors its social media accounts. So in particular, our Facebook and our Instagram accounts. And we've seen a significant increase in folks utilizing those services to reach out to us. There's a lot of intersection between economic hardship and access to resources. And so for folks that maybe don't have a phone that they can use to call people, they only have, for example, a Wi-Fi phone, or they're not able to call because they're living with their abuser. Our hypothesis is this is why we're seeing more folks reach out to ways in which they can text for support versus having to call and have an audio, an oral conversation with somebody. So I'll remind you of that at the end of this, but just know that we also can provide crisis services over Facebook, Instagram, and email as well if a hotline number doesn't make sense for the person that you're supporting.
And I would just add too, we've heard from a number of clients who go to our Facebook page, and they may not necessarily reach out, but appreciating some of the content we've been posting. We've had some advocates who've done some videos around coping strategies and just sharing information about how they can get connected in safe ways. So even if individuals are not reaching out at that point because of safety concerns, we are hearing that individuals are looking at those videos and looking at the affirmations that we post. So that's always one way to, if you know somebody who's experiencing domestic violence at home, it's one soft way they can still get some support and remain engaged.
Yeah, Jared or Maddie, would one of you post the link to Safe Haven's YouTube channel in the chat box? So as Holly talked about, we have some just some safety planning videos that we've created, and a video that one of our advocates created around coping strategies. So that could be a good resource to share with individuals. So wanted to provide a quick kind of overview of how folks gain access to our services. And for the most part, it looks the same, but I'll highlight some differences that we are seeing right now as a result of our current situation. And so usually somebody's first point of access is through a hotline call. Obviously, we know now that might be through Instagram or Facebook. But once folks make contact with us, we just spend some time trying to get to understand what their current need is. Not everybody that reaches out to us are at a point where they are ready to leave or physically able to leave an abuser. And so a lot of times we will work with individuals multiple different times before they're even ready to start thinking about what services they want to engage in, whether that's support group or case management, or exploring shelter options. And I think that need has maybe even increased a bit during this current situation, because we know that folks often, we're often hearing them report struggles just with their overall mental health. And so Safe Haven has had to provide just sometimes those points of validation and listening and processing. One of the things that I heard from an advocate that surprised me a little bit, but makes perfect sense, is a lot of clients that we've worked with in the past that have kind of not continued working with us, like they just had ended their time with us because they didn't see a need anymore, are actually starting to re-engage in services with Safe Haven over the last few weeks. And so I would hypothesize that, again, just this stressor of the current climate that we're living in can be really taxing on folks' mental health. And so being a person that somebody can talk with, just as a totally unbiased, unopinionated sounding board, is a really good recommendation that I would have for any of you that are in a space to be able to provide that, because we've definitely seen from our perspective that being a very helpful way to kind of respond to the need in the community. And so once somebody makes contact with us, however they might, we will do an assessment if they are looking to get connected with services. And one of the things that's really great is that doesn't have to happen between the hours of 8 and 5. So all of our staff that are taking hotline calls are able to do those assessments, and that's especially important because we are finding that we're getting more calls in the late evening or early morning hours, because that's when, for example, their abuser is asleep. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to do if you are referring somebody to Safe Haven is to point out some of these things, like it's okay to call after 5. If you can't call, you can reach them on their Facebook. It may seem obvious to us that those are options, but especially for somebody in crisis, a lot of times they aren't able to process that information to think like, oh, I could actually maybe call when they're asleep. And so just helping brainstorm with them could be really helpful. And then we connect them with the services that best fit what they want. All of our services are self-referral, so they don't need to come from any sort of clinician referral or outside agency referral. Anybody can engage whenever they're ready. All of our services are completely free, our direct services, so we don't bill. We don't require any sort of insurance information, or even identification in order to provide services. One of the barriers that sometimes can be created if we were to bill for a service is that that service gets noted in a report, insurance report that gets sent to the home where the abuser is also living. And so we as an agency try to remove as many of those barriers as possible so that it makes it easier for somebody to engage in services with us. Does anybody have any questions about how to get somebody connected with our services? All right. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So wanting to take a second just to kind of define how we talk about domestic violence here at Safe Haven. And so the definition that we use is a pattern of learned behaviors that one person uses to control another in an intimate relationship. And so there's a couple things that are really important to that definition. The first being that it's a learned behavior. And I want to especially emphasize that given our current climate. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. But COVID-19 is not the root cause of domestic violence. So I want to repeat that again. COVID-19 is not causing people to become violent. Violence is a learned behavior. So to give a really oversimplified example, an abuser doesn't wake up one day and say, today seems like a good day to be abusive towards my partner. Where do people learn behaviors from? I'm just trying to engage the group and I'm learning how this works or doesn't. And with such a large group, I'm not sure if I can do the open-ended questions.
By seeing it in action.
Yeah, by seeing it in action.
Like children learn from their parents.
Absolutely. So being part of growing up in a home where somebody is exposed to violence, that can be a contributing factor. Absolutely.
I think another one is the videos and TV and media. Right now, there's just a lot of violence there, and people pick it up and want to imitate it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting, a huge emphasis of what Safe Haven's prevention team does is focuses on shifting social norms that contribute to violence. And so I've been really fascinated and interested in the media's coverage of domestic violence and COVID-19, because in some ways I see it contributing to a falsity around this issue, in the sense that because people are stressed, all of a sudden we have more people becoming abusive. And so, like those that kind of spoke up pointed out, it's something that is gradually learned throughout somebody's environment. It's not just this point in time thing that somebody loses their job and then they become abusive. And so really wanting to challenge that and be careful of how many of you have seen, maybe just by a show of hands, news coverage lately around COVID-19 and domestic violence? So a fair amount of you. There's been a ton. Oh, Holly, look at you.
Oh, wow.
Hand raise. Yeah, so we've seen a lot of coverage on that. And even how law enforcement, which is a lot of the statistics that the media has been using to talk about domestic violence, is a lot broader than even the definition that we use here at Safe Haven. So for example, if law enforcement goes out to a home and there is an altercation between two siblings, or an altercation between a parent or a caregiver and a roommate or another sibling, all of those cases get classified as a domestic violence. And so even some of these reports that domestic violence is up is a little bit more complex than what the numbers just show. However, I don't want to also create this idea that domestic violence is not an issue currently, because it absolutely is. And my example too about kind of how law enforcement qualifies domestic violence versus how maybe an agency like Safe Haven would really gets to that part that we define domestic violence as something that happens within an intimate partner relationship. So that doesn't mean they have to be married. It doesn't mean that they had to have been dating for a period of time. I think that even in this current period that we're living in, around resource scarcity, especially around housing, we often see an uptick in folks kind of entering into relationships really quickly to try to have a basic need met. For example, if I, am in a relationship with this person, I might have a place to live, and I currently don't have a place to live. And when people enter into those types of situations, it does create more risk and vulnerability for them to experience violence. And so we're going to come back to that when we talk about some things that churches can do to provide support in those moments. But yeah, so this is the definition that we use. I'm going to give you some more concrete behavioral examples in a moment. But again, I want to highlight this last bullet point. Mental illness, substance use, and stress do not cause domestic violence. They can intensify cases, but they are not the root cause. And so if you are working, for example, with a household or with a family, and for the first time you are hearing disclosures that that a person in that household is experiencing violence, it's not likely that COVID-19 was what led to that, but maybe the behaviors have gotten so severe or so extreme that it's hit that breaking point for that person, to the point where they do need to reach out for help. And so I would especially caution you around those instances if you're for the first time learning that somebody's experiencing abuse, to really, do some sound listening, and not that you have to be an investigator, but a lot of times they're coming from a place of desperation. And I think that we're seeing that a lot over the last few weeks. And I suspect we'll continue to see that as social isolation continues. Anybody have any questions about the definition that we use? All right. So this is a power and control wheel. Many of you are probably quite familiar with this. We created our own at Safe Haven because, one, we wanted to add some color to a pretty boring black and white power and control wheel. And two, because we really wanted it to be relevant and reflect the current trends and behaviors that we're seeing in intimate partner relationships where there is violence. And so I also, I know I tried to share this earlier with folks, and I think I shared it too early. And so not everybody was able to see it. And I'm not quite sure how to do it while I'm talking. And so I will email a version of this out to you after our call is done. I will also email you some safety planning documents I'm going to talk about in a moment as well. 1 second. Okay, so these are all different types of abusive tactics that abusers can use. It's obviously not exhaustive, but it definitely does capture a lot of the commonalities that we see. One thing I want to get clear on really quickly is that when we use the term violence, we don't necessarily mean that it has to include physical touch. And a lot of times we can create a valued scale around conversations around domestic violence, where we say physical abuse is here being the most extreme, and then we have emotional and psychological abuse. And even from a victim survivor standpoint, we often hear them say, well, at least they didn't hit me. Or it hasn't gotten that bad, it's just emotional abuse. And so really cautioning us on creating a valued scale. From a neurological standpoint, from a trauma standpoint, we know that all of these different forms of abuse on this wheel can be just as harmful and and create just as many safety risks sometimes as physical violence can. And a lot of times too, and I think especially during a time like this, maybe folks that aren't experiencing physical violence may feel that they are not as deserving as of services that Safe Haven offers. Sometimes I've heard survivors create this narrative where I don't want to take resources away from somebody else that is experiencing a more severe form of violence, like physical violence. And part of that is just very common behavior that we see with people that have experienced trauma. A lot of low self-esteem, not a lot of significant value put on their self-worth. And abusers often, play into that as well by telling victims that they're worthless or they're not deserving. And so if you're seeing those attitudes or beliefs spread, really trying to proactively challenge those and say, no, what you're experiencing is real. It is absolutely something that is not healthy, and you are absolutely deserving of services and a healthy relationship, because sometimes people really do need to hear that because they may not have ever heard that before. Yes, I see that. Can I explain technological and social abuse? Yeah. So let's start with technological abuse. Maddie, who's also on this call, her and I had an opportunity yesterday to do a quick little Q&A with an organization called Community Kids. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with them, but they offer some after-school programming that's particularly targeted on the west side of Grand Rapids. And one of the things that they had brought to our attention is the increased risk and vulnerability that teens in particular are being faced with right now as we move to a more digital or technologically based community. And technology is not new, right? It's been around in many different forms way before COVID-19. But as a result of social isolation, almost all of our interactions have moved to this online space, which just creates more vulnerabilities for potential victims and more opportunities for perpetrators that are choosing to use violence. So I'll define technological abuse, and then I'll also talk a little bit about how we see that impacting teen dating relationships as well. So technological abuse is any way, shape, or form that an abuser uses technology to exert power and control over their victim. And so that can be anything from tracking their location. It can be saving, without the victim or survivor's knowledge, saving login information to things like email accounts or bank accounts as a way to exert more power and control over their finances. We have found it to be quite normal, and I'll use an example from when we work with high schoolers. It's become quite normal that if you are in a relationship with somebody, it is just their right to have your passwords or login information to your accounts like Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok. And so even using those accounts to monitor who people are talking to, and oftentimes that can escalate to then an abuser becoming more controlling around who somebody can talk to and who they can private message and who they cannot.
And we also see that shift too, where even adults will then use it as, I am the person who's paying for this phone line, and I deserve that ability to see what's on your phone.
Absolutely, and we don't want to downplay that parents have that right to make that decision if they're paying for those accounts. I think one of the things that's really important to recognize, particularly with teen dating relationships, is we've worked with a lot of families where their teen is experiencing abuse over technology, and so the parent or caregiver goes to a place of just removing access for that teen having access to that phone or that social media account, which oftentimes can lead to retaliation from the abuser's standpoint because the victim is no longer responding to their texts or responding to their calls. And so if that situation presents itself, just encouraging that parent or caregiver to have as honest and transparent conversations with the need so that it doesn't put that child at more risk. Holly, any other examples that you're seeing from a direct service standpoint?
Yeah, I think that was good. I mean, technology can be used too for some of that like revenge kind of tactic, where they might an abuser can share embarrassing or private photos or information about their victim, and share that with kids or with employers. So that's always a pretty common way to use technology. Yeah, that would be one of the bigger ones that I can think of.
Yeah. Oftentimes that tactic that Holly's talking about is called revenge porn. We don't like to use that term as much because it infers that the victim did something to deserve having their photos shared or distributed. But it is very common, and it's especially common with teens and young adults. There was a recent survey done, I believe last year, maybe now it's 2 years ago, but it had surveyed a bunch of high school aged youth around their use of sharing and sending nude or partially nude photos to a significant other. And of those that chose to do that, how many of them reported having those photos or videos shared beyond the intended receiver? And that was 63% of individuals. And so I imagine that now more than ever, those are potential risks or realities that we might see going on in our community. And so just encouraging parents to have those conversations with their children, and you can do it in a, what would you do if somebody asked you for a photo that you felt uncomfortable sharing? Or what do your friends do if they are pressured to send a nude video and they don't want to? What advice might you give them? And so moving it off of just that individual and allowing them to talk about it almost as a third person are some tactics that we found to be especially helpful. The main thing I want to emphasize here is that somebody does not have to be a computer scientist to use technology to abuse. For a long time, when technology was first really, especially social media and the internet was really becoming a new thing, you did have to be pretty tech savvy to know how to use those spaces in harmful ways. And now you absolutely do not. Something as simple as keeping, not having your account on private opens you up to a lot of different risks. And so we see technology being that vehicle for abuse much more frequently than I think we have in decades past. Social abuse, I saw somebody asked about that one as well, and I think that's especially timely to our conversation today. And so just to kind of refresh, domestic violence is about power and control. And in a climate where a lot of people's control is being taken away in some degree or fashion, it can lead abusers to kind of go to new measures to try to regain that power and control over their victim. And so outside of a COVID-19 lens, oftentimes social abuse could look like preventing somebody from hanging out with friends or family. It could be intentionally sabotaging friendships or family relationships, because if the abuser can cut off the outside ties that a person has, it makes that abuse that much easier to perpetrate, because there's not as many people kind of checking in on that individual or supporting them. And their options of leaving often get smaller and smaller the more social abuse that is happening in their life, the more isolation that abuser can create. And then you throw COVID-19 into that mix, and it's almost like you have this perfect storm, especially for victims that are cohabitating with their abuser, where isolation is already there and it's constant and it's really across the board. And so that's where when we think, what is it going to look like in the future? I think we see domestic violence agencies in particular really having some concern about what is that need going to look like once we are able to kind of navigate our worlds in any resemblance of a normal way. And so just being mindful of that. This one kind of fits into social abuse, but I also might put it into spiritual abuse as well. We often see abusers create a triangulation within church communities, within faith communities, where they try to position usually somebody that holds power or leadership in a particular, let's say, for example, a church, and they try to position that individual against the victim. And I think that, again, COVID-19 kind of provides this perfect storm for things like that to happen. And so I'll give you an example of a common behavior that I see. And I want you to think about how something like this could happen even more easily in our current environment. So for example, an abuser going to, we'll just say, a pastor, and saying to the pastor, I am just so worried about my partner, about my wife, about my husband. They are just mentally ill. They are not doing well. If they happen to reach out, just let me know. I'm so sorry if they do that. They aren't well, and we're trying to support them. If you could just pray for them and help as we try to get them the help that they need. And so this is a really common tactic that we see, and abusers are really manipulative. They can be. And they often are really well liked in their communities. And so oftentimes there can seem to be this really genuine, authentic request that's being made, when if we peel back some of those layers, we see that in fact the abuser is doing that to just further isolate and diminish that victim or survivor's credibility. So that if that victim or survivor does ever reach out for help, the abuser's actions may lessen the likelihood that they will be believed. And the hard thing about this is it isn't universal, right? Not every single person in your community that comes to you and says, hey, I need help, caring for my spouse, is inherently an abuser, right? So you have to really just kind of enter into those spaces with a lot of critical thinking, and which you probably already do, right? I don't want to patronize anybody thinking that you don't normally do that, but really trust your gut in those moments too. If something doesn't feel right, chances are it's not. And so I'll give you some tips in a moment of ways that you can kind of ask some clarifying questions that are especially helpful as abusers potentially try to leverage other entities in their power and control tactics. Does anybody have any other questions about any of them that are up here? I'll actually switch to this screen, which gives you some definitions. Again, I'm going to send this document out to all of you.
Tara, I will add, and hi everyone, my name is Jared Daniels. I work at Safe Haven Ministries as a violence prevention specialist. As far as technology abuse goes, that we do have a resource for parents and caregivers. It's called Protect Young Eyes, and I'll put it up in the chat. But basically it kind of goes through a lot of the different types of social media and technology devices that are out there for folks who may not be aware or who just don't have the knowledge around that kind of thing. It might be beyond your era or whatnot, but they go into depth talking about some of the pros and cons of each one and kind of how it's used and how parents and caregivers can really protect young folks from it. So I'll post that in the chat right now.
That's awesome, Jared. Thank you. The training on like technology is something that we do as a standalone training. And so there's so much that we could uncover and unpack just focusing on technology. And so I appreciate Jared putting that out there, because I think more now than ever, we need to be really cautious around how youth in our life are accessing and using social media. Because of all the obvious reasons, right? So just keeping that in mind. Let's see here. The final thing that I want to note, because I've seen some of this come through in some of our hotline calls, is the using children. And And I think especially now, I've heard quite a few reports where the abuser may still have some level of custody. And in this scenario, I'm assuming that the victim and the abuser are no longer cohabitating. But where the abuser has some sort of custody over the children, but as a result of COVID-19 are refusing to give the children back to the non-offending parent, and they are sorting, well, I don't want to give them back because I don't want to increase the likelihood that our children will transmit or get COVID-19. And again, like so many of these other scenarios that we'll give on face level, we could definitely see how that might be a good step. But from an abuser's lens, that just becomes a really easy way to maintain that power and control by sourcing or citing a real pandemic that's happening. And so if you are encountering those things, especially if you're working with somebody that's struggling with things around custody, please reach out to Safe Haven. One of the things that you probably have seen is much of our court systems are closed. However, things like personal protection orders and custody orders are still being processed. It just looks a little different. And so it might not be somebody going directly to the courthouse. There are some different channels that folks need to take. And instead of explaining all those and the complexity of those, I would just encourage you to reach out to Safe Haven if you are currently working with somebody that is experiencing some of those challenges. Anything else you want me to touch on here before I move on to the next slide? All right. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes really honing in on some of the tactics that we see kind of being intensified as a result of COVID-19. And so, like I had mentioned, obviously domestic violence is all about power and control. And COVID-19 really has led a lot of abusers to kind of try even more to gain power because they themselves are losing some of that in all components of their life. And so there's been some really fascinating research done following other natural disasters, worldwide pandemics, for example, Hurricane Katrina and 9/11. And what the data shows is that in those immediate weeks and months following a pandemic, rates of violence often either stay the same or they intensify. It's not that you all of a sudden have new people that are choosing violence, but where violence was already present, it often intensifies. But that doesn't necessarily translate to individuals reaching out for help. And so my word of caution is if you're sitting in a space right now where you're thinking, you know, wow, I'm really glad I went to this training. I currently don't know anybody that's experiencing domestic violence, but you're kind of on that, wanting to be proactive about that, really wanting to acknowledge the importance of that, because just because somebody isn't reaching out to you yet doesn't mean that you don't have folks in your congregations that are experiencing this. And especially if you've had some suspicion prior to COVID-19 that somebody may be experiencing some challenges in the home, if it's safe, really encouraging you to make some of those touch points, at least to just check in to see how are individuals doing, how are they handling situations, especially if you haven't heard from them in a while. The other thing I want to talk about is kind of just
there. I would just say, like, those touch points and check-ins, they don't necessarily have to be explicit about asking about any type of, you know, what's going on in the home. Just the presence and being available and being a resource can be really impactful.
Thanks, Holly. And I want to come back to that too a little bit, because I think there's some really good strategies that we can take with families, regardless of whether or not we suspect that they're experiencing abuse. And so I'm going to come back to that in a moment as well. job loss and economic constraints are not a root cause of domestic violence, but it can intensify domestic violence. And so recognizing that not only does our current economic landscape impact how people are experiencing violence, it also has significant impact on people's ability to leave an abusive relationship. And so I'm going to ask a question in a moment that's going to come back to this around, like, what are some of those creative ways that we can support people that are currently faced with, job loss or reduction in hours or intermittent furlough? Because I know that's a approach that a lot of businesses are taking, where they're not necessarily laying people off. They're having them take intermittent weeks of furlough, which has created even more inequities for folks that already are living at or below the poverty level, even because of the turnaround time from being able to get a pandemic unemployment assistance or unemployment assistance. And so we'll talk about that in a moment as well. The other thing that is really important when we talk about domestic violence, particularly the prevention of domestic violence, we focus heavily on something called protective factors and risk factors. Anybody here come from a healthcare background, medical background, social work background? Okay. Sorry. So if you do, this language might be a bit familiar to you. If not, maybe you've heard it other places. But protective factors are essentially a whole host of things that we can do to reduce the likelihood that somebody will choose violence. So it reduces the likelihood that an abuser will choose to abuse somebody. And we're really intentional in the language that we use there, because violence is always a choice. And then we also talk about risk factors. And the more risk factors that somebody has, the more likely they are to experience violence, and the more likely they are to choose violence. And across the board, and I'm talking about domestic violence, but I'm also talking about substance abuse, mental health or mental illness, bullying behavior. Across the board, one of the most significant protective factors to eliminate the likelihood that somebody will experience those things that I just named is something called social connectedness. And so when somebody feels that they are invested in their community, they have community supports, their community creates accountability for them, they're going to be less likely to choose violence, because the risk in doing so is so great. So for example, somebody that is not employed or jumps back and forth between a lot of jobs, somebody that maybe is really transient and doesn't really have a lot of connections in a particular community. They aren't plugged into, for example, a church or any sort of extracurricular activities. They're far more likely to use violence because nobody's holding them accountable to those actions. And so COVID-19 in a lot of ways has kind of exacerbated these situations, where as a result of people not being as routinely connected with other support systems, it's really increased the likelihood that they can experience forms of violence. And so one of the things that I've started to see organizations start to address is how, in a period of social distancing, can we still stay socially connected with one another? And the outcomes of those things are obvious, right? People can feel that they're cared for. It often helps our mental health, but it also becomes a really effective strategy for preventing things like domestic violence. And so I kind of want to put it back on you all. What are some innovative ways that you all have found, not even necessarily related to domestic violence, but what are some of those innovative ways that you've been able to continue to stay connected to your community and provide support to them?
Ann Ferris says lots of phone calls, which is an amazing way to keep up and check in on people.
Mara says a lot of online content. They're starting to make phone calls to 2,600 families. Wow, that's quite an endeavor.
Skype with grandkids.
Emails, calls, letters. I think that is a really good way. This is a good time to really bring that back into trend.
There's even a huge amount of research out there around people receiving like actual letters and cards, and that direct correlation with an increased mood and overall increase in somebody's mental health. And so one of you had said, it's not that innovative. No, it's not. But as a society, we've gotten away from a lot of these things. And so it is new for a lot of us, especially folks that up until now, may not have had a lot of those phone conversations. It may have been texting and short, snippets of conversations, but not an actual commitment to sit down and check in with how is somebody doing.
Tara, we had, I'm thinking of a handful of women that opened up about not being safe at home this year, where we helped them get connected to a counselor, but then we also helped them get in a small group where they got in a Bible study. So they had that spiritual support through friends and through getting in God's word. So now they all moved to Zoom and they're meeting still. And one group in particular is meeting on Saturday nights just for one, where things are really unsafe at home right now, just for her, really. So that's one thing.
Yeah. And that's, I appreciate that. And I think I've seen a lot of people really do a good job at creating those online spaces, much like we're doing right now, right, over Zoom. And there's a lot of free resources out there as well. So Zoom, you can do video calling up to 40 minutes for free. You have to create an account and it's free. If you want more than, to have a call longer than 40 minutes, I think the cheapest account is $14.99. But maybe that's something that you all could even think about bringing back to your respective spaces of, how do we even offer that up as an option to our congregants, to our community, that $14.99 may be cost prohibitive, but are there ways for your church to rally around that? And even kind of take the lead that, hey, we're going to create these spaces and then step back. Kind of, it sounds like maybe what Rachel, your group may have done, like, it kind of sounds like it organically started to happen where you're not probably involved in every one of those calls, are you? No, right? So, and that's the beautiful thing about this is that people are really resilient, right? And allowing them to create those spaces for support can be really helpful. Google Hangout is another free resource. There are plenty and plenty of apps that you can do different games. What's the one I'm thinking? You don't know what I'm thinking of because I haven't said it, but it has some House Party. House Party is another really good resource. And you might be wondering, okay, Tara, what does House Party have to do with domestic violence? But really right now for folks, they might not have the mental capacity to talk about their trauma or their abuse because it's so overwhelming. But giving them a space to just be and feel joy and make connection actually is a really good way to build protective factors within a community or among somebody that may be experiencing domestic violence. So I'm just reading some of the things that are coming up in our chat.
I did want to add one thing if I could. Hi, everyone. I work with kids, and something that I did last week, which I think I would never normally do, and this is more lighthearted, but I just bought some cookies from the dollar store, and I ding-dong ditched like 30 people, but half the people are so, like, got nothing going on that they actually came to the door before I could get back in the car. And And so I had eyeballs on a whole bunch of people last week that I would have never, ever gone to their porch normally. But it was actually really healthy just to see someone from, 6 to 10 feet away and just to see their kids come to the door. And so I feel like if I were suspicious that someone was maybe not in a healthier situation, we could do like I'm just bringing some cookies, but then you'd still be able to see, and there's someone on someone's porch. Like, oh, we're not totally isolated.
Mhm.
But it's also a really fun way just to be, to see someone. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Liz. And I think even as an agency, Safe Haven has wrestled a little bit about, as we try to still build, a team space for our employees, and we try to like foster, organic ways to check in and see how people are doing. We've gone back and forth of like, is the work that we're doing so heavy that we don't want to create this superficial space to just be human and talk about what we're eating or what we're doing or the craft we're working on? Because we didn't want it to seem insensitive to the day-to-day struggles that our advocate team in particular are working through. But the feedback that we've gotten time and time again is that those spaces are actually really important. Whether it's to provide a mental break, whether, Liz, I think your example demonstrates a really effective way to build trust with folks. So a victim of domestic violence often risks everything in their decision to come forward and disclose that they're being abused. And more times than not, victims of domestic violence don't first turn to an organization like Safe Haven. They, in fact, are usually turning to a close friend, family member, mentor, leader. And Liz, I think your example shows a really easy but meaningful way to build some of that trust, so that down the road, if that person that you doorbell ditched with cookies needs help beyond that, you've already kind of done some of that foundational work, that you're not just coming in and saying, hey, I think you're experiencing abuse, let's talk about it. Because that can be really abrasive, right? Or it can be really hard for somebody to feel like, oh, this is something that somebody truly cares about, and I am safe to talk about, the challenges that I'm going through.
Yeah, Tara, and in the chat, Mara had mentioned that really not liking the word social isolation. It's really physical isolation, and that we're not necessarily socially isolated, and kind of seeing some of the things that people are talking about. Again, Mara brought up WebEx, which I've seen. It allows folks to, at least one person, to create the platform and bring in others through phone, and doesn't have to use any type of video-like capability, or even doing the option of, I don't know who mentioned that. Dawn, thank you for mentioning the lunch drive-through idea. I've seen that a lot on social media, of people just kind of meeting up with friends, family, whoever, at local parking lots, and just kind of talking through the windows of their car. Just because we are physically isolated doesn't mean that we have to not check in on each other, or even lose that capability of being able to talk to each other. So thank you for mentioning all of that.
That was really good. The next slide that I'm showing you is that these are some tips that our advocates have come up with. And so kind of how we framed this was, what are some things that you would recommend to a friend or family member that was trying to support somebody experiencing domestic violence? And so just a quick plug, and I'll send this out in an email, but I'll also type it right here. If you go to our website, so I'm just gonna send it in the chat right now, gr.org/COVID-19. So if you head over to our website, you'll actually find an exhaustive list of some of these resources that I'm about to give. But these are some of the steps that we've heard from advocates, that they've heard from clients, that have been really helpful. So if somebody, for example, isn't able to call for help because their abuser lives with them, encouraging them, maybe can you say, hey, I need to go, to the grocery store, and reminding them that in that drive, it might be a good time to reach out for help. Again, it might seem obvious, but providing those like reminders can be really important, because when folks are in crisis, how they process and think even concretely through steps can be really difficult, just because of the neurobiology of how our brains work. And so just those subtle, pointing those things out. I know even for me, I've recognized a lot of times as I've tried to problem solve things in the last few weeks, I am not as sharp as I, remember being. Like simple things that somebody will say, well, did you think about doing it this way? And I'm like, no, that seems so obvious, but I hadn't. And so there's those really kind reminders of like how to do some of these things can be really helpful. Encouraging them to go for a walk, to maybe say, hey, if you went out on the back patio, could you potentially call Safe Haven or a support person? Our hotline, like I said, is available in the evening and through the night. We've seen an uptick in calls coming in kind of after our traditional 9 to 5 hours. And so reminding folks that even if they call at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., they will still talk directly with a live person. We will still be there to support them. Nothing really changes based on what time of day that they're calling us. Other things around both phone safety and just overall technological safety is encouraging folks to remember to clear their browsing history, reminding folks to routinely clear their cache and their cookies. That is, there's a lot of really simple and easy tutorials on the internet on how to do that. But again, just trying to reduce some of that risk so that, Googling Safe Haven's website doesn't become something that poses a risk for increased violence. Holly, anything else that you've heard from advocates that they've shared with clients that have been especially helpful?
No, I think these are, unfortunately, while there's not a lot of tips here, they're pretty comprehensive right now. I had put in the chat just some of those frequent ways that abusers are isolating or controlling phone use or taking it away. So it has been really challenging. We've seen too an increase in like more touch points, but shorter bursts of time. So somebody might only have 10 minutes to connect. So even, as you're talking with folks and encouraging them to get connected, it's okay that those are only 10, 15-minute conversations right now. And there can still be some meaningful work done in that short amount of time.
Absolutely. Let's see here. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to add to this one. I think that's good. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So the other thing that we had talked about with our advocates kind of in preparation for this meeting is like, what are some of the things that they would recommend to faith communities that they could do to help support victims and survivors of domestic violence? So build check-ins into your routine. Routines can help maintain normalcy. So just that reminder that now more than ever, having those consistent touch points with folks that you care about is really important. I really like the idea of potentially leveraging some small groups that you maybe already have or Bible studies that you already have, and asking, is there a leader within each of those groups that could kind of champion making contact with the other people in that group, so that you don't have it all on one person's shoulders. And that kind of goes to that last bullet point that as you have folks providing support to people in your respective communities, that work can be really taxing and really emotionally draining. And so making sure that, I forget who said that you all were making calls to 2,000 individuals. I wouldn't assume that that's one person, right? But whoever are making those calls, making sure we're taking care of those people as well, especially if they're supporting somebody through a crisis like domestic or sexual violence. Another really helpful tool is offer to create a safety plan with that person that's experiencing violence, so that you're in the know. so that you also can be aware as well to when you might need to step in. A lot of times folks will have individuals that we're working with, so victims or survivors of domestic violence, oftentimes will have one or two, not all the time, but oftentimes will have one or two people that they might have within their safety network, within their support system, that they can go to if they need support. And so maybe that's you. And so talk through with that person, you know, if they plan to make contact with you, for example, every 3 days. And the third day comes and goes and they haven't made contact with you yet. Preemptively exploring with that person, for example, what do you want me to do if our next point of contact is going to be this Thursday, and Thursday I don't hear from you? Do you want me to call you? Do you want me to send you a Facebook message? Do you want me to call the police to do a welfare check? Really trying to do all that work on the front end, because oftentimes when we're in that peak of crisis, it's the worst time to be making some of these decisions. And so, yeah, is there anything else you'd add to that, Holly?
Yeah, I would say even sometimes just creating a safety word, and that if the individual says this, you know, specific phrase or this specific word, then the individual would know that, you know, to contact 911 on their behalf, or to, you know, somehow check in. I read an article today too, where you could even, for neighbors, you know, put something in a window. And if that piece of paper is in the window, knowing that that's not things are not safe right now. And again, discussing, when I see that, what do you want me to do with that information? Do you want me to call 911 or just to be aware? So those are a few things that I've been seeing going around as well. And then the only other thing too, that creating a safety plan can just even be an emotional safety plan. And, you know, just offering people to have, you know, reach out for emotional support, or reminding that, hey, just because they say you're a bad parent doesn't mean that you are. Like, how can you protect yourself from hearing those messages from their abusive partner?
That's really helpful, Holly. And I put this up here, the emotional safety plan that Holly was talking about. And just practicing these things as you're working with individuals is really important. I'm going to go back a slide really quickly, because Jared, I think this gets to your point, and Safe Haven definitely didn't come up with this saying, and I'm seeing it used more and more in the community, and I really like it. Physically distant, socially connected. And so there's this resource, Vital Village Network, that's been doing a lot of, they're out of California, and they're doing a lot of work around how do we still provide social services to some of our most vulnerable populations during a time of self-quarantine. And so they've been championing some of this messaging, and they had a really just kind of simple graphic that I couldn't find anymore, but I do remember taking notes on it. And so the listening, connection, seeking and offering support, compassion, and resource sharing were kind of those top 5 things that they said are important for individuals to, organizations or churches or faith communities to take on as they are providing support to people in their community. And I think dispelling myths has also been something that's been even more important than ever. For example, I'm on my neighborhood association Facebook page, which sometimes I wonder why, because I don't need more stress. If anybody else is on neighborhood association pages, you know the black hole it can go down. But one of the things I do see quite a bit is just a lot of misinformation being spread that, you know, for example, my car was broken into a few nights ago, and everybody's like, well, police aren't coming out for those. They're not handling those types of reports anymore. But I filed a police report, and they contacted me back and took the information. And so the same goes to with, I've heard some misinformation that, like, if somebody calls 911, law enforcement isn't coming out. They're only sending drones, which isn't true either. So just really providing some clarity and dispelling some of those myths that, like, if you are experiencing domestic violence and you're at risk and you're concerned about your personal safety, absolutely still call 911. Law enforcement is still operating. They're still responding to calls. Now, they might not come out to my call about somebody leaving trash on my front lawn, right? But these emergent issues, they absolutely are still responding. And so just dispelling some of those myths in the community that are taking place. And then just practicing compassion, both with ourselves and others, I think is especially important during this time as well. Thoughts or questions on anything that we've talked about so far?
I just also want to bring up, Tara, because we kind of talked about, or somebody had brought this up earlier in the chat, but with kind of questions and what they wanted to learn from this. Another big thing along with safety planning is that you can't always play the superhero. And what I mean by that is that you may know of someone who is in a potentially very violent situation, but your involvement in it may make it possibly worse. So really kind of doing the safety plan with them if you can, working out those nuances with that person, allowing them to make a lot of those decisions. So when it does come down to it, because they are the most knowledgeable about their own situation, that's something that we really want to push on folks here during this conversation. Really the big part is just listening, even if there's so many other things going on and you feel like you can be the one to step in. Sometimes all that person may need is just someone to listen, because they're just not at that point to necessarily go to those next steps of calling the police or even calling us at Safe Haven. I would also encourage a lot of you to even use our services just because of secondary trauma. You may be bearing witness to somebody's violence via phone, via a virtual conference kind of like this. And we just want to make sure that everyone is practicing a form of safety planning, especially emotionally safety planning.
Yeah, that's really good, Jared. Thank you. So I did, again, put in the chat a personal safety plan and power control. We'll email those out as well. I don't know why this font looks so weird, but these are just some more tangible safety planning steps. Holly alluded to earlier, folks maybe having trouble calling, knowing that even if, as long as they have a phone that's charged, even if they, for example, weren't able to pay their phone bill because of economic hardship, as long as that phone has as long as that phone is charged, they can always call 911 with that phone, even if there's no more minutes, even if they're not carrying a plan with it anymore. So how many of you, maybe just by show of hands, have old phones just laying around your house? In a drawer? Mine's are in my junk drawer. So first plug, when this COVID-19 is done, Safe Haven accepts those old phones and we use them to generate more funds for our services. But in a more serious note, those are great phones for folks that are experiencing violence to place around their home. So maybe if their abuser, for example, smashes or takes away their primary phone, they know that they have what we call like a 911 phone saved in a drawer that the abuser doesn't normally go into. And so helping them think through some of those action steps can be another good way to help keep them safe. Also, there's oftentimes I hear from folks like, oh, if I hear neighbors fighting, like it's none of my business, I shouldn't get involved. And that tends to be a social norm that's kind of shared across all different communities. But if you're working with a victim or survivor of domestic violence and they feel comfortable doing this, having them talk to their neighbors, kind of like you said, Holly, and say, hey, if you hear screaming, please call 911. Kind of that permission giving, so that if the situation does escalate, that bystander feels empowered to make that call and isn't thinking like, oh, it's none of my business, I shouldn't do this, I don't want them to get mad at me if I do call 911. Safety planning with children is also really important, letting them, dependent on their developmental stage, right? But, talking through to them, where do they go if things escalate? Who can they go to? Who can they call? What can they do? And we don't like to think about, a situation getting to that place, but it can be a really important conversation to have with children that are living in homes where violence is routinely happening. So some additional things, and Jared, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of some of what you talked about because it was really important, especially in this time where a lot of folks are really stretched thin. Their mental health may be significantly impacted by this. The idea of leaving an abuser can become almost paralyzing, so overwhelming that it almost talking about that can create more harm than good. And so just really cautioning us, whether you're receiving a disclosure or you're, talking to somebody who you suspect may be in an abusive relationship, at all points of that, allowing them to be an expert in their lived experience and using their kind of following their what's the word I'm looking for, their initiative. Like if they're not talking about leaving, or they're not saying, hey, I want to leave but I don't know how, being really conscious that we don't try to just push that on them, because that can create, one, emotional hardship, but two, if they leave before they're truly ready, oftentimes they're more likely to return back to the abuser. And when they do, research tells us that often becomes an even more dangerous situation for them, because that abuser has lost that power and control. So they're going to go to more extreme measures to regain that power and control. Other things that I want to really talk about is just being aware of our own bias, even particularly around domestic violence. We often see bias around race, around economic background, knowing that no particular lived experience, identity, prevents somebody from experiencing violence. And so it's happening in our most affluent communities, and it's happening in some of our poorest communities. And so just making sure that we don't make assumptions based on any of those bias.
Yeah, Tara, and in the chat, Jane had said the bigger struggle might be being there for the victim who does not admit/acknowledge the abuse. And that just, thank you for making that point. I think that is a really hard thing, being someone who has done direct service and like worked with folks who just aren't at that point to admit what they're going through is abuse or violence. The only thing that you can do in that situation when they are not ready or at that point is to really just continue to offer support and continue to be there. And also be able to set your own boundaries with yourself, knowing when it becomes too much for even you to handle. Because that's a valid and very fair concern, to witness someone going through something so traumatic or even violent and kind of having to constantly be there, but they're just not at that point. And very much like what Tara was saying, that it could do more harm than good to say, you're in an abusive relationship, so you need to leave. I'm going to help you pack your bags and we're going to figure something out. It's going to be a lot more helpful, and it's going to be a little bit more helpful to them in the long run for them to kind of come to that realization themselves versus us making it for them, because then it becomes a point of resentment.
Really well said. Thank you. So we are almost at time. I want to end just on one last thing, and that's just really making note, and I think I've already done this throughout our conversation, but the current period that we're in, we know that domestic violence is happening, even though we might not be seeing it. And so just really encouraging you all to remain forward thinking and forward focused, because I don't think that we are anywhere near the peak of the need that we're going to see. And in fact, I think we are going to see some pretty significant surges in need once this stay-at-home order is lifted. And so just being really mindful of that as you're planning around what you are doing to support folks, to not have it stop once that pandemic, or once we move beyond this stay-at-home order or restrictions, things like that. We know that folks on the margins of our communities already have experienced a lot of inequities around being able to access and receive services. This need is only going to grow as we continue to work through this pandemic. And so just really challenging you to continue to check in and provide support to folks that already are probably experiencing some challenges in accessing services. This is just a list of domestic violence hotline. I know I have folks on here from Kent County and Ottawa County and maybe even beyond that. I will send this out to you all, but I wanted it to just be available in the recording as well. And then the final document I will share with you in a email is this. It says, I know it's really tiny, so you probably can't read it, but this was a really great resource that I believe was put out by Kent County. And so it's a whole list of mental health resources that are still up and running and available during our stay-at-home order. And I really appreciate the time that was put into giving the numbers that you need to call to access these services, so people don't have to go through multiple channels of telling their story, saying their need, to land with the person that can actually help provide them with the services. And that's one thing we want to be conscious of, is the more time somebody has to ask for help, the more time somebody has to share their story, the less likely it is that they are going to continue to try to find a support system, because that can be mentally and emotionally draining. So I will send that to you all as well. We are at 3 o'clock right now. And I want to be mindful that many of you may have to jump off right this moment. Does anybody have any outstanding questions or thoughts that would be timely in order for us to answer right now? All right. Well, my email address you all have. You'll see an email from me shortly. Again, just thanking you all for the work that you're doing. Taking an hour and a half out of your time is extremely valuable. And I know one of the things that our advocates requested was just to continue to keep Safe Haven in your prayers. Our shelter is at capacity. And so as we continue to do this work, praying for individuals and families, as well as our staff that are on the front line, really providing that day-to-day care. So you all could keep that in your thoughts and prayers. We would really appreciate that. With that, I'm going to end. So I hope you all have a great day.